As the clock ticked past midnight on a balmy December evening in 1998, all was calm aboard the cruise ship Monarch of the Seas. She was built for luxury, and at the time exemplified the best of the best in modern cruising. She was, at 73,937 gross tons, one of the largest cruise ships in the world. That evening, as she navigated through the waters off St. Martin in the Caribbean, passengers indulged in gourmet cuisine, lavish entertainment, and breathtaking views. As everybody settled in for the night, they were totally unaware of what was about to happen. In seconds, their carefree trip was transformed when their ship dragged itself over a reef, tearing the hull like tissue paper. What happened over the next few hours was a brilliant demonstration of why ship safety measures are in place and how they can save hundreds of lives. But curiously, the incident has been forgotten almost entirely by the general public. The Monarch of the Seas, owned and operated by Royal Caribbean International, was a favourite for many in the cruise industry in the 1990s. With a substantial gross tonnage of 73,937 tonnes and an impressive length of about 880 feet, or 268 metres, she was equipped with an impressive range of amenities and features including an outdoor basketball court, a climbing wall, a selection of pools, all the usual bars and restaurants. But it hadn't all been smooth sailing. Early in her construction, the ship had been gutted by a fire after a welding accident. She had to be completely rebuilt at the shipyard. But despite its onboard magnificence, all was not well with this ship, because few aboard could know that it would soon be involved in an incident and almost sunk, and it would put all of those safety standards and procedures that had been generated through the last few decades into practice. In the early hours of Tuesday, December 15th, 1998, on her journey from the US Virgin Islands to Martinique, the Monarch of the Seas had to make an unplanned stop. The ship was forced to make an emergency diversion to Philipsburg, St. Martin, as a passenger on board had suffered from a suspected heart attack and needed to be disembarked immediately. As the passenger was escorted to shore with the ship's doctor, nurse, and a small detachment of crew, the Monarch of the Seas waited in the pristine waters off Great Bay, staying in position under her bow thrusters and her engines. Wind conditions were light, visibility was clear in all directions. At about 1:25 a.m, the doctor and his small team returned aboard, and the ship's crew prepared to get back on track to their original destination, Martinique. Now this is where things began to go wrong. There were 5 crew members on the bridge that night: the captain, the staff captain, his second in command, the officer on watch, the helmsman, and the duty helmsman, who was asked to serve as a lookout. Now, once everyone was back on board, the captain was faced with a challenge, as his ship had to negotiate getting around the nearby, dangerous Proselyte Reef. He navigated primarily by sight, while relying on assistance from the officer on watch, who was making calculations using the ship's Automatic Radar Plotting Aid, or ARPA for short. The calculations he made that night were for the ship to pass the reef within the closest possible approach, a distance of some 3 cables, or about 0.3 nautical miles, off the reef's lighted night marker buoy, which essentially marked it out as a hazard at night time. Unfortunately, the crew would soon find out that the calculations and the plotted course, they were all wrong. About 1:28 a.m, the ship's captain handed navigational duties over to the officer on the watch because of an unexpected problem. He was suffering from a gastrointestinal issue that had been spreading throughout the ship. Before leaving the bridge, he confirmed twice with the crew their position, their safe distance from the buoy and the reef, which could be visually seen at that point, and headed down to his quarters. At the later investigation, the staff captain, who was not part of the navigation efforts, noted that he was actually surprised to see the ship's course was being set to pass east of the Proselyte Reef light buoy, which was not the usual route. But he didn't question it. The course taken on the night was considered a more direct, but riskier course toward Martinique. Now, this was most likely done to make up for the time lost disembarking the sick passenger. The officer on watch began making a planned course change that would take the vessel safely around the south side of the reef, when 2 seemingly benign things happened next. A call came through regarding a passenger complaining of noise, which the officer on watch said he would attend to shortly, and then an automatic smoke alarm sounded on the bridge, which was quickly silenced by the lookout and cleared of any issues. Then, a moment later, at 1:30 a.m, as the Monarch of the Sea's course started changing, it happened. The ship grazed across the proselyte reef at a speed of 12 knots. While it was not stuck on the reef, the damage had been clearly done. Feeling the vibrations from the hit, the captain raced straight back to the bridge. He burst in and demanded, "Where are we, and what has happened?" taking back command of his ship. After conducting a thorough assessment of the damage, it was soon apparent that the vessel had suffered significant structural impact. The open gash along the starboard side of the hull ran 40 metres, that's 131 feet long, by 2 metres, or 6.5 feet wide, similar in length to 2 full basketball courts. She was opened up like a tin can. Monarch began taking on water and going down by the head. A number of tanks and compartments below the waterline began to flood. The pumps were helpless against the flow of water rushing into the ship. It was clear she was living on borrowed time. At about 1:35 a.m, as Monarch of the Seas continued to take on water, the captain consulted with his senior officers and made the decision to return to St. Martin and intentionally ground the ship on a sandbank in Great Bay. Now, this would prevent the vessel from sinking completely, or, most dangerously of all, listing and capsizing before an evacuation. With the situation growing increasingly dire, the crew now faced a race against time to ensure the safety of themselves as well as their passengers. 12 minutes later, 7 short blasts and 1 long blast from the ship's public address system signalled a general emergency to all passengers and crew. To avoid a panic, the captain made them aware over the PA system of the exact nature of the situation. Now, this was crucial. We'll come back to that later. What happened next was a orderly and careful evacuation, which came from years of drill and delicate preparations. Miami's marine operations and the St. Martin port authorities were notified in turn. The ship's lifeboats were made ready for launching, and then, from the shore, the Coast Guard began readying local tender vessels to actually assist in the evacuation. Over the next hour, those frequent updates were given over the public address system in English, Spanish, French, and German, with the captain requesting repeatedly that passengers and crew get dressed, don their life jackets, and report to their muster stations. It was time to prepare to abandon ship. At about 2:35 a.m, the captain then intentionally guided his ship into a soft sandbar in St. Martin's Great Bay, grounding it smoothly to a halt with no further damage. Monarch was now, thankfully, at no risk of sinking, and the evacuation could properly get underway. Over the following 3 hours, those shore-based tender boats from St. Martin carried all 2,500-odd passengers safely away from the ship. The breaking dawn showed a very strange sight. Monarch of the Seas, down by the head, with a slick of oil on the surface of the pristine azure sea. Despite the dramatic scene, though, a disastrous loss of life had been averted, and everybody was safe and sound. So, what exactly had gone wrong? Well, of course, following the incident, a pretty major investigation was launched that pieced apart everything very forensically, picked apart all the circumstances to try and draw out areas for improvement. This was led jointly by the Norwegian maritime investigator and the US Coast Guard. The meticulous inquiry aimed to dissect every aspect of the ship's operations. The results were documented in a 62-page report outlining every detail of the night, and it makes for very interesting, dramatic reading. Through thorough interviews, detailed data analysis, and in-depth evidence examination, it became very clear that the accident was caused by what the investigation called, direct quote, a myriad of human performance deficiencies. All the ship's radar and navigation equipment had been found to be in fine working order, but it soon became clear to investigators that the crew had been entirely at fault. Now, there were plenty of critical and more obvious oversights, like, for example, the failure to refer to updated charts that mapped out the corrected location of the proselyte reef marker buoy. The report also found that the original course plotted to pass the reef had been set without the ship's actual exact position having been marked first, which is really ship navigation 101 type stuff. In fact, the captain, when he left the bridge, had simply assumed his subordinates would check for themselves. If the crew had tracked this, they would have found that their vessel had actually drifted quite a lot while it had been stopped disembarking the sick passenger. The drift was never taken into account when setting the new course using the ARPA, or Automatic Radar Plotting Aid. And not only that, but the report actually found that there was too much reliance on the reef's light buoy and the actual ARPA as the sole markers for determining the ship's position in relation to the reef. Using GPS or even just traditional navigational techniques like terrestrial navigation would have given an accurate fix on the Monarch's position. Coupled with a lack of cohesion and awareness among the bridge crew, the stage was set for an accident of epic proportions. A deeper examination revealed there had been a complete breakdown in communication between the bridge crew and the captain and other key departments on board. The captain himself was distracted by his gut issue, but he did not pass command over to his staff captain because of it. Departure checklists went unused. The staff captain, the second most senior officer on board, had no idea of the captain's plans and was actually surprised by the course he had chosen. The report found that he trusted the captain so implicitly that he never questioned him about it. The seemingly benign phone call from the ship's purser concerning the passenger complaining of noise and that fire alarm that sounded, both of those things had distracted from the bridge crew's focus at a critical moment. In fact, the crew member, who was actually trying to plot the Monarch's position via the radar, as well as keeping his eye on the reef's marker buoy, had then also taken the phone call from the purser and then tried to handle all three of those tasks at the same time. The already stretched resources on the bridge were saddled with more issues. If not for those mundane distractions, the bridge crew might have actually noticed what was about to happen. Now, despite many of the circumstances leading up to the incident, some commendation was actually deserved for the captain and the crew for the actions taken after the grounding. The safe beaching of the ship so it couldn't sink, and that evacuation that worked like clockwork. It showed that thanks to all the careful drills and intensive safety training, a big ship could be evacuated in a short amount of time with everybody got away safely. Monarch of the Sea's passengers had expected a holiday in the sun, but this would truly be a vacation they would never forget. Monarch's captain and senior officers were found to have committed at least 11 specific errors which caused the accident, and the captain's behaviour was blamed on complacency. He knew those waters well, had been there many times before. It lulled him into a false sense of security. When combined with a pressing health issue, he was clearly ready to cut some corners. More worryingly though, the report found that the captain's complacency registered with the crew as easy confidence. He seemed completely in control of the situation, so nobody dared question him, not even his own second-in-command. It's telling that many of the recommendations made by the report refer specifically to human resources and management, that future crews should go through team-building exercises together, and that senior officers should be trained specifically as regards communicating and dealing with their junior subordinates. Now, there's actually one final twist buried in this report, because it turns out that one of the ship's watertight doors hadn't closed properly, and it's thought that had the ship not been intentionally beached, the Monarch would have sunk. The whole story serves as a cautionary tale for any would-be captains and sailors out there that complacency kills. It doesn't matter how many times you've been in that stretch of waters before, bending the rules can, and often does, lead to disaster. Monarch of the Seas was lucky because she could be beached and saved, but other ships, like Costa Concordia, more recently in 2012, were not so fortunate. The Monarch story has gone down largely forgotten to history, but its lessons shouldn't be ignored. Since the earliest days of shipbuilding, engineers have faced a difficult challenge: how to actually get their new creations into the water in the first place. Ships can't just be built in the ocean. They need to be constructed on land and then launched or floated out of a dry dock. The problem is that the process of launching a ship isn't just as simple as shoving it into the water. Complex calculations have to be done to make sure something doesn't go wrong. Unfortunately, through history, a few ship launches have done just that, resulting in minor inconveniences all the way to tragic fatalities. For starters, let's look at a very famous ship launch that had some rather unexpected results for onlookers. September 26th, 1934, and perched high up on the slipway overlooking Clydebank, Scotland, was the mighty white hull of the RMS Queen Mary, shortly to become the largest floating object in human history up to that point. The ship's construction had been marred by financial troubles and the Great Depression, but by 1934, the hour had finally arrived, and the pride of British shipbuilding was at last ready to take to the water. Queen Mary was absolutely immense. Her hull was 1,019 feet, or 310 meters long, and even empty, it all weighed well over 36,000 tons. Once completed, the ship would eventually weigh in at 77,400. Now, the ship had been built to be launched backwards into the Clyde River, but this alone was no simple task. The river itself had to be widened and deepened to accommodate the monstrous ship's hull. If they didn't widen it, then the launched ship would immediately beach itself on the opposite side of the bank. To smoothen the ride and prevent excess friction, hundreds of tons of tallow fat and soap were lathered onto the slipway beneath the ship, And to arrest the hull, hundreds of more tons of heavy drag chains were attached to the hull so that they would bring the ship to a stop once it was afloat. The stage was set, and the hour had at last arrived. Her Majesty, Queen Mary of Teck, revealed the liner's name, and a bottle of Australian wine broke against the hull. Then these big steel triggers were released, and with a rumble, the hull was set free to fall down the slipway and into the river. The whole thing was captured by newsreels and cameramen, and watched by tens of thousands of spectators on all sides of the River Clyde, some in specially designed stands. Those on the opposite side of the river to the launch arguably had the finest view along the entire length of the ship's hull, but then there came an unexpected event. As Queen Mary roared into the river, she displaced nearly 40,000 tons of the Clyde, which needed to go somewhere. It surged up and poured over the riverbank like an enormous tidal wave, catching onlookers completely off guard. Suddenly, a 2-foot-high wave broke over the bank and surged around the spectators' ankles, catching some of them off their feet and drenching them completely. Now, it's not known exactly how many people were soaked, but dozens at least were caught by the wave. There were no injuries from the event, and many actually found it quite funny, but it shows clearly the impressive physics at play behind the launching of a ship. Queen Mary's launch was ultimately successful, and the chains brought her to a halt, after which tugs came alongside to take her to a fitting out wharf for completion. Now, it's a fun little side note in the story of this legendary ship, but history tells us that sometimes waves caused by ship launches could prove extremely dangerous. Now, about 36 years earlier, in 1898, a new warship was being readied for launch. She was called the HMS Albion. She was a battleship, one of the newest and most powerful in Britain's fleet. She displaced about 14,000 tons and was about 420 feet or 128 meters long, impressive for a warship of the age. She'd been built at the Thames Ironworks shipyard in London, right on the River Thames itself. Towering over the skyline of small houses and factory chimneys was the huge white hull of the ship, and as ever, it caused quite the scene. Thousands came out to see the event, with many lining the decks of nearby ships. Specifically for this occasion though, viewing platforms had been constructed on the Thames around the slipway so guests could see the launch up close and personal. One of these was a wooden stage with support struts built to accommodate just a small party of workmen, but on the day it was burdened by over 200 people. Now, incredibly, the launch itself was actually filmed by at least 2 separate cameramen, giving us a rare glimpse into this special bit of history. Mary of Teck, the actual very same Mary of Teck who'd launched the Queen Mary in 1934, was at that point just the Duchess of York. She launched the Albion, and thousands of pairs of eyes watched on as the ship slipped down into the river. Although this footage looks peaceful and the launch was indeed a success, it had shocking consequences for the nearly 200 people perched atop on one of the viewing platforms. As Albion hit the water, she too caused a huge wave that rolled over the river and smashed into the supports of the stage. The wooden legs gave way and the entire structure crashed down into the water with over 100 spectators, many of them women and children. The issue was that the cries for help and the sirens were drowned out by the steam whistles which boomed out celebrating the launch of the ship. Eventually the news spread that something had gone horribly wrong, and dozens of people were struggling to keep their heads above water. All this in an era when many people couldn't actually swim, and woolen clothes, once drenched, weighed an absolute ton. Workmen and spectators dived in heroically to help, and they plucked quite a few people out to safety, but in the end nearly 30 people had died, the youngest being just 3 months old. It was one of the worst Thames peacetime tragedies and resulted in some serious controversy because the footage of the launch, although it had not captured the actual stage collapse, was distributed afterwards, which many saw as poor taste. The footage of the aftermath and the rescue efforts in particular was seen by the Victorian public as poor form, but it actually stands today as one of, if not the earliest examples of journalism covering a disaster using the film camera. The Thames is no stranger to failed launches though. It had actually played host to another disastrous attempt some years earlier in November 1857. Now this was probably one of the most ambitious undertakings in all of engineering history because it had almost no parallel up until that point. Famous engineer Isambard Brunel had worked closely with other engineers and naval architects, notably John Scott Russell, to design and build an absolutely monstrous ship for her time. SS Great Eastern was no less than 18,915 gross registered tons, about 5 times bigger than the previous biggest ship in the world from just the year prior. That size record would not be surpassed for more than 40 years. Now the issue was the immense ship was clearly decades ahead of its time. Few thought the thing would actually work. The infrastructure required to support a vessel of that size just didn't exist yet. Getting it into the water to begin with would be a huge task. Brunel and his team proposed what should have been a simple solution. No slipway in the world was yet big enough to support Great Eastern. Instead, she'd be built on a ramp opposite Greenwich on the Thames in London. The ramp could support the Great Eastern's hull, which itself would sit on a kind of cradle. The idea was that once supports were removed, the cradle would move along the tallow-coated ramp's rails and the Great Eastern would slide gently into the river sideways. Now, the launch had to be timed for the perfect tide that would then carry the ship's hull safely away from the banks. And then finally, on November 3rd, 1857, the moment had come. The Great Eastern's 692-foot, 210-metre, 12,000-ton hull began to rumble down. But then, things went wrong. The ship moved 4 feet. When her way was checked, the launch system failed, and a man was killed by falling timbers. Great Eastern became lodged, unable to move and stranded like some kind of enormous iron whale. Of course, it caused Brunel and his team to be relentlessly mocked, which is especially unfair since Brunel had actually been doing his best to downplay the event, since he must have feared or even suspected that something could go wrong. But amidst the mockery came sympathetic parties, other engineers who wanted to help. They wrote in with ideas and advice. A huge amount of equipment was assembled to actually bodily haul the ship down into the river over the course of 2 months, and finally, in January 1858, the massive vessel was afloat. It had not only been an embarrassing affair, it had actually cost the ship's backers a small fortune. Great Eastern's failed launch was just the first chapter in an epic and bizarre tale of a ship marred by poor fortunes and strange happenstance. Today, you can actually still visit the launch site because it's been largely preserved at Millwall, London. Now, Brunel had some kind of ill premonition that something about his launch might go wrong, but in the case of this next launch, it was a freak accident that nobody could have seen coming. The SS Daphne of 1883 was a small steamer built in Govan, Scotland, on the Clyde River. She was only about 450 tons, designed to run on the regular service to Ireland from Glasgow. It was only a short voyage, so she didn't need to be too large. The ship was only about 178 feet or 54 metres long. The timeline for delivering ships like this was quite tight, and she was not a vessel of any real prestige, so her launch was seen as little more than a practical affair. Dozens of workmen were aboard doing their jobs to get the ship ready for service when the hull was launched into the river. Now, the idea was for 2 anchors, one on each side, to check her progress so that she'd come to a rest, but that day something went horribly wrong. The starboard anchor held, but the port anchor dragged, causing the ship to swing wildly around. The river's strong current caught her and hurled the entire thing over onto her side. She capsized and flooded almost immediately, trapping dozens of the workmen on board. The rolling caught them completely off guard and actually threw many up top into the river. One survivor later wrote, "I felt the vessel toppling over to the right, and in a moment every person on board was hurled into the water. The shrieks and cries were terrible. I, along with some others, scrambled onto the bottom of the vessel, which was turned upside down and retained a hold. In a few moments, a man came around with a small boat and asked me to jump into the water. I did so and was rescued. I believe that over 200 people were in the vessel. I cannot possibly describe the heartbreaking scenes which I witnessed." 124 workers, many of them in their 20s or younger, were killed when the Daphne rolled over, causing an outpouring of grief from the tightly knit Glaswegian shipbuilding community, and immediately tough questions had to be asked. An established inquiry surprised all by actually clearing the yard's owners of all blame. And the families and friends of victims were outraged and accused the investigative bodies of a cover-up. Now, regardless, the disaster did actually result in reforms that limited the number of personnel that could be aboard ships during a launch and also ensured that heavy equipment and tools were fastened down during the event. The ship's wreck was not actually a write-off. She was eventually salvaged, repaired, and put into service as the SS Rose. Today, you can actually find 2 memorials to the Daphne in Govan, even though the disaster has essentially been consigned to the history books and is today little known. Now finally, let's end on a slightly lighter note. This is the launching of the infamous SS Principessa Yolanda, which is actually a ship we've covered on this channel before, but the story doesn't get any less ridiculous every time I tell it. The ship was supposed to represent the very finest of Italian shipbuilding when she was completed and ready for launch in 1907. She was actually the largest passenger vessel yet built in Italy up to that point, and boasted magnificent, luxurious interiors. She was perched high up on the slipway at Riva Trigoso. Dozens of important government officials, dignitaries, and businessmen were invited to watch the spectacle, and the usual throng of hundreds and hundreds of onlookers were drawn to the amazing sight. Now, you might notice something unusual about the Principessa. Most ships are launched in an unfinished state. This means that the ship's hulls are at their lightest, they're easier to control and arrest after the launch. Principessa Yolanda's builders, however, decided to mix things up a bit. The ship was virtually completed, with all of her tall external fittings like funnels and masts fixed into position, all of her furniture. The time came, the signal was given, the Principessa Yolanda roared down into the water to the cheers and applause of thousands, and then she immediately rolled over. Now, the ship's mostly completed state was offset by the fact that the ballast, or the weight, deep in the ship's hull designed to balance it all out, had not been taken on. It meant that the ship's centre of gravity, at launch, was very high up, and the vessel was a top-heavy white elephant. With a groan, the ship listed and rolled before lying completely flat on her side. Fortunately, the Principessa did so gently, and it gave the captain and those guests aboard time to escape safely in the ship's boats, and nobody was hurt or killed. But the incident was, of course, highly embarrassing. Even worse was the fact that surveyors concluded the ship was a complete write-off. She couldn't be salvaged or repaired. It had taken around 2 years for the complex, technologically advanced and luxurious ship to be built, but she had lasted just an hour on the water's surface. Lessons were obviously learned, and a future sister ship was launched in the usual unfinished state, but the poor old Principessa Yolanda was broken up for scrap, having travelled just a couple of 100 feet from where she'd been built. Ship launches are an incredible spectacle, but if history tells us anything, it's that the immense physics at play deserve to be respected. Now, if you ever get invited to attend a launch of a ship the size of something like the Queen Mary, go ahead and enjoy it, but maybe just make sure to pack a spare change of trousers in case of unexpected tidal waves. You're on a cruise enjoying a holiday. You lean up against the railing, taking in the view, your eyes to the sky, a fresh cocktail in your hands. Up until now, the weather has been quite pleasant, the sea calm, but over the last few hours, dark clouds have rolled in, blotting out the sun, and the sea's kicked up to a nasty chop. Those out on deck, who have been enjoying a drink with their friends or activities with their families all day, now duck inside for shelter. Then it occurs to you in that moment, the only thing standing between you and the monstrous seas below is the metal railing of the ship you've been leaning against. Suddenly, you hear a crew member barking into their radio the words, "Oscar, Oscar, Oscar." The ship comes to a stop and starts a turn. You and the other passengers exchange confused and worried glances, and then a name begins to be repeated over the ship's loudspeaker. The situation becomes clear. A passenger has just gone overboard, and your leisurely holiday has now turned into a rescue mission. The idea of a passenger falling overboard from a ship might seem somewhat archaic. It was, after all, more common in the age of sailing ships, where safety regulations, ship design, and crew training were not yet as advanced as they are today. As early as the late 19th century, ships began to introduce more widespread safety measures to prevent passengers from falling overboard, and today's cruise ships come equipped even with features like man-overboard detection systems that will automatically alert the crew in the event of a passenger falling off the ship. But we'll go over those in more detail later on. Despite these advancements, accidents still do occur, with some 325 people going overboard ships or ferries between the years 2000 to 2018. Reasons for these accidents range from slippery decks to poor lighting, rough weather, and sheer human error, usually exacerbated by intoxication. But no matter what sent a passenger over the railing to begin with, once they're overboard, it becomes a race against time if they wish to have any hope of survival. Those who fall overboard at night or with no witnesses tend to have the most grim outcome, because once the ship has moved on from their position, it's unlikely they'll be spotted again, because the ship can't double back in time. Only around 17 to 25% of those who fall overboard are ever rescued, meaning that time is of the absolute essence if a passenger is to be recovered after a fall. Historically, man-overboard incidents, or MOBs as they're referred to in the maritime industry, aren't really tracked or analysed that much because they're kind of seen as something as a blip on the radar, an outlier from usual events. But one man, Ross Klein of the Memorial University of Newfoundland, has been tracking MOB data since 2000 to give us a better picture of the modern-day statistics surrounding these incidents. The data has proved invaluable to demonstrate an important aspect of safety at sea that's generally ignored, but the fact that these records only go back as far as the year 2000 underlines how little of that data has been publicly known throughout history. While Klein's records have given us a much greater understanding of the frequency of MOBs since the new millennium, there's still much to be learned from these occurrences. It might be tempting to believe that the slim odds of survival and falling overboard on a modern cruise ship would mean that man-overboard incidents in the age of the Oceanliner must have been essentially a death warrant. But stories exist of passengers taking a spill from the decks of ocean liners back in the day and living to tell the tale. On November 4th, 1907, a trimmer intentionally jumped overboard from the German liner SS Bremen. An alarm was immediately sounded because somebody saw him, and the ship was turned around back toward the trimmer's position. A lifeboat was lowered quickly with an officer and 4 sailors aboard to ferry him back to safety. Having clearly changed his mind about his intentions, the trimmer was quickly spotted swimming strongly enough to keep up with the rough seas, and within half an hour he was safely back on board his ship. 6 years earlier, in March 1901, a crew member of the SS Austral lost his footing during a boat drill and slipped overboard into the sea. A keen sailor's instinct kicked in, and he promptly swam away from the ship as he hit the water to avoid being sucked in toward the propeller. A lifebuoy was thrown from the ship and drifted some 2 miles before he was able to take hold of it, and a manned lifeboat wasn't far behind to pull him to safety. The entire sequence of events, from the sailor's fall to his eventual rescue and the Austral being underway once again, took no longer than 20 minutes, a further testament to the quick thinking and efficiency of ships' crew members back in the day. Now, not every historical incident had such a happy ending, and in fact some pretty serious mysteries surround a few of these. One of the most interesting is that of Mr. Rudolf Diesel, known for the invention of his famous engine. He boarded the steamship Dresden on September 29, 1913 for a quick overnight voyage from Belgium to England. At the end of the night, around 10 p.m, he retired to his cabin, but the next morning he was nowhere to be found. His bed had not been slept in, his nightclothes were still laid out neatly. But sometime in the night, Diesel had stepped out of his cabin, never to return. Days later, his body was found floating by a pilot boat, but the events surrounding his death sparked endless speculation. Some claimed that it was an accident, some claimed that it wasn't. Conspiracy theories assert that his death had actually been a homicide perpetrated by the German government, who weren't too happy that the German-born inventor was on his way to show off his handiwork to the British Admiralty. The theories and speculation run rampant to this day, but it's safe to say we'll likely never know the truth regarding the demise of the famous inventor on board the Dresden. But how did older ships actually try to prevent man-overboard situations? Well, in the case of early great ocean liners like Olympic, lookouts remained at their posts around the clock, especially in the stern section, where typically a quartermaster kept a close watch for anyone going overboard from the ship's docking bridge. If someone went overboard, they could verbally raise the alarm, and once the rest of the crew were alerted to the fact that a passenger had gone overboard, the ship would reverse course and make its way back to the victim's last known position at reduced speed. Life rings were kept around the ship's railing so they could be thrown after the person who'd gone in. It would help them keep afloat, and they would also make it easier to see them. The ship's 2 emergency cutters, which were kept swung out permanently with a lamp burning each night, would be manned by a few crew members and lowered to the sea in an attempt to search for the poor victim. Now, later ships like Aquitania and the Queen Mary actually employed more advanced motor launchers for this purpose. They actually had their own engines they could go searching out into the ocean. Lifebuoys were also kept close at hand should the victim be spotted in the water close enough to the ship to be within some reach. Other ships like Lusitania made use of a really clever device called the night lifebuoy, which actually floated and ignited flares on contact with the water so it could easily be seen in the dark. But despite all of this, the odds of actually surviving a man overboard situation were dreadfully slim. Once word of the incident reached the bridge, the first order of business was to stop the engines and initiate a turn, which was in itself a complex and very time-consuming process. A ship the size of Queen Mary, for instance, travelling at speed would take anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes to stop and fully execute the turn, and in this time the ship would have travelled considerably far away from the victim. At a speed of 24 knots, for example, the ship will have travelled a half mile per minute, meaning that by the time the ship was even on its way back, they'd already steamed as much as 5 nautical miles away. Once the ship reached the victim's last known position, spotting them was the next hurdle, because with the chop of the water and the foamy whitecaps, it made it nigh impossible to actually see the victim, who could only be visible from the neck up. Compared to the massive scale of a ship, a lone human bobbing in the water looks like little more than a tiny speck. Sound, unfortunately, doesn't travel very far in the open ocean, so the victim's shouts could likely go unheard. If not immediately rescued, a person who's gone overboard faces a very grim and certain fate. Exposure to freezing water temperatures means that hypothermia is one of the most immediate risks, but if exposure is not the concern, then the unfortunate march of time will be. Without any extra flotation, most humans can only tread water for around 2 or 3 hours, meaning that once you hit the water, the clock has already started ticking. It's a bleak fate, and one that's unfortunately Not unlikely, as on modern cruise ships, 1 or 2 people come face to face with this nightmare scenario almost every month. Now this is despite all of our advancements in safety regulations, high-tech equipment, and more efficient protocols. And one of these really clever devices used nowadays is a kind of automatic detection system. It uses thermal imaging cameras and small radars along the hull to detect a large signature over the side. Now this automatically raises an alarm on the bridge. The systems are mounted along the hull in stations, and the biggest cruise ships can have as many as 12 or so. The system itself can cost around $250,000, so it's no small investment. The issue is, though, that the system creates a prevalence for false alarms. Large seabirds, for example, could trigger the alarm. The truth is there's no surefire way to guarantee someone who falls overboard will ever be seen in the first place. Between 2009 and 2019, only 48 people out of the 212 who fell overboard were ever saved from the water. The cruise industry as a whole seems quite content to sweep those statistics under the rug, oftentimes citing drunkenness or irresponsible behaviour as the reasons why a passenger might fall overboard. The theory, or the mentality, seems to be that if every passenger is behaving responsibly, it should be near impossible to fall off the ship at all. But when the cruise industry relies so heavily on the profits earned from alcohol purchases on board and the sale of drink packages, a different problem emerges. Promoting responsible behaviour suddenly becomes something of financial liability, one that most cruise lines are kind of hesitant to take. The consequences of this can actually be disastrous, as it was in 2016 when Samantha Broberg boarded the Carnival Liberty for a vacation with her 2 close friends. By 2 a.m. that same night, she'd been served some 19 drinks and found herself sitting atop the ship's railing with her back to the ocean. Whether it was caused by the roll of the ship or her own inebriated state, just a few moments later, Samantha lost her balance and fell backwards into the sea. Her friends, who were asleep at the time, were none the wiser until the next morning when her disappearance was finally reported to the crew. By 5 p.m. the Coast Guard was brought in to search for Samantha, but by then it was far, far too late. Surveillance footage later gave Samantha's family the answers they sought, but not the answers they'd been hoping for. Cruise lines also like to assert that some of the man overboard situations are intentional, and while this may very well be the case for some, the dead, as we all know, tell no tales. And for many of those who met this tragic fate will never know the truth surrounding their demise. In May of 2024, a man was reported to have gone overboard the Royal Caribbean's Icon of the Seas, the world's newest and largest cruise ships. Details were scarce, with passengers even being informed by the ship's captain that the man in question had been found safe, an announcement which was met with cheers and applause throughout the ship. But later, word began to spread that the man had indeed been found, but he had not survived the ordeal. While confusing, for the most part this turn of events was largely shrugged off. A passenger on board described the lukewarm reaction to the news from his fellow travellers by saying it just seemed like more people would have been like, "Oh my gosh, what's going on?" But no, people were just going about their day. It's kind of dystopian. Sometimes the impossible can happen though. In around 2022, James Michael Grimes fell overboard from a cruise ship and survived 20 hours treading water in the ocean, and he was found alive and well. When stepping aboard a ship of any kind, a passenger is assuming a level of responsibility for their own behaviour, and they should acknowledge their role in their own safety. It seems for the most part that your average ship's passenger understands this, and that's why instances of people falling overboard remain relatively rare. But as we've seen, both historically and in the modern era, these incidents are still not unheard of. So what can really be done to stop it? Well, short of enclosing passengers entirely indoors, it seems there will always be incidents of people falling or even jumping overboard, be it under the influence or otherwise. These incidents are just rare enough that cruise lines see them as little more than a blip on the radar, so the bulk of the responsibility falls with the passenger to be aware of their surroundings and keep a close eye on their friends, family, and fellow travellers. So next time you're on a cruise or a transatlantic crossing, whatever you do, please don't climb any railings or sit on top of them, because you might accidentally make a splash. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. And as always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.